The glow of the neon skyline hinted at sunrise as Dr. Eirik Finnegan stepped off the transport pod. His face stoic, he gazed at the towering structure ahead, a colossal building etched with iridescent lines of circuitry. The descending holographic sign read, Neuroarchitecture Lab. Inside, the air was crisp, laced with the faint tang of ozone from the machinery. To his left, the familiar sight of 100 flickering holographic screens greeted him. To his right, a co-worker nodded at him, eyebrows raised in the trenchant way that seemed particularly reserved for the early shift. Eirik nodded back, his hand lightly grazing over the neural interface band strapped to his left wrist. His office was a symphony of seamless technology and warm sienna woods. The digital desktop hummed, awash with holographic data motors, spinning gently in constellations of linked nodes, standing testament to the minds he had traversed. Eirik was regarded as one of the leading mind sculptors in the field. A psychologist's significance spiked immensely in a world where mental architecture had quite literally become a canvas of thought and memory manipulation. A ping on his communication panel pulled him from his reverie, announcing his first patient's arrival. Dressed in a simple jumpsuit, her dark hair cropped short, she stepped in. Her intense gaze was tempered with a fleeting shadow of uneasiness. "Mira," he greeted, nodding slightly. She returned the nod, her gaze steady on his. A wristband gleamed on her wrist, a neural counterpart of Eirik's. He gestured to the chair opposite his desk. She perched on it, silently revealing the faint tattoo across her neck bearing her military rank. Lieutenant Mira Leonov, a name he'd memorized from her files. She was a war veteran, now a financial analyst. A significant switch. A switch tinged in the palette of post-war trauma, he reckoned. PTSD. The letters were etched in invisible ink under her calm demeanor. Eirik initiated the sculpt session, a bloom of soft lights coalescing into a mental map between them. The layout was a labyrinth of intense trauma clusters. A network of twisting cobalt memories took shape, casting a mirror image of battlefield and bloodshed in a hue of blue. But within the maze, he detected an anomaly. An intricate interweaving of crimson strands kept separate from the personal memories. The crimson strands sang of an encrypted formation, an orchestrated barrier guarding something inside. But what could it guard? A memory leak? An implanted memory? Or a code? The curiosity gripped him. Mira was no ordinary patient. She was a puzzle, a mystery waiting to be unraveled. What ensued was a symphony of assault and defense. Eirik glided over mental barricades, seeped through lanes of resistance while he dug deeper into the anomaly. He wasn't just a mind sculptor, he was a soldier too. This was a psychological battlefield. As the session drew to a close, Eirik emerged from the connection, a chill running down his spine. This was not PTSD. Something else lurked behind the barricades of Mira's mind. In the quiet aftermath, he turned a grave look at Mira, whose gaze held an odd flicker. Recognition? Fear? Or was it a plea for help? He couldn't tell. But one thing was certain. He was about to uncover a secret, something that had nothing to do with the warfare of guns and explosives, but with his world of neurons and synapses. Eirik sat back, staring at the now dormant sculpt session quivering on his screen. The topographical map of encoded memories was not of grief, but a strategy or information. Of what, he was yet to discover. In the back of his mind, a chilling thought took root, sending a shiver down his spine. Could his life's work be turned into a weapon? He closed his eyes, fingers weaving through his salt and pepper hair as a soft sigh escaped his lips. The seeds of doubt were sown. Now he had to face the storm. Eirik spent the following days diving into the depths of Mira's mind with a renewed sense of urgency. He entered her neural maze like a diligent miner, chipping away at mental walls, sifting through the sands of confusion, spearheading towards the truth buried deep below. His intuition told him that behind Mira's stark gaze hid secrets not hers alone to bear. Each session painted Eirik a clearer picture of the less ordinary side of his profession. It was an odd sensation, as if unearthing an artifact in his own backyard. He knew minds, he had spent decades unweaving them, yet this was a corner unvisited, unlit till now. The series of cryptic memories he unearthed from Mira's fortress were disjointed at first glance, yet they bore a striking semblance to classified military files. Snippets of strategic locations, security protocols, encrypted data. This was not PTSD. It was a data vault, a library of covert knowledge planted into her psyche. Mira was a courier carrying secrets she wasn't privy to. The revelation left Eirik cold, but he allowed himself no time to wallow in disbelief. Instead, he began to tread discreetly into research archives, sleuthing through his grand field of neuroscience, and then wider, to data encryption, induced memory encoding, his curiosity evolving into a slowly burning fury. The cloak of suspicion started creeping over his usual unruffled professionalism. He began ruffling the pages of forgotten regional legislations, suspicious filed patents, amendments creeping their way into otherwise ironclad ethics around neurodigital manipulation. What he stumbled upon, in the murkier corners of encryptions and subclauses, made his blood run cold. His grand field of neuroscience, his beloved profession of sculpting minds, there were attempts to turn it into a mechanism to store national secrets, a way to breed memory soldiers carrying classified information without even knowing it. Suddenly, the oddities he had noticed in Mira's mind made a horrific kind of sense. Was Mira one of these memory soldiers? Eirik lived the following week in a perpetual haze of denial and acceptance. He stood at an intersection where ethics and ambition crossed paths. Each meeting with Mira began to pose questions far heavier than either of them had signed up for. Then came the day he was summoned to a closed-door meeting with high-ranking officials, generals, and the head of Neuroarchitecture Lab, individuals who usually didn't pay personal visits to mind sculptors. His findings had ruffled some dignitaries, making them surface from their mighty towers. He knew he was treading dangerous waters. The confrontation was quick, the threats veiled under bureaucratic niceties and national security. But the underlying message was clear: compliance or dire consequences. Eirik returned to his office that evening, his mind ablaze. He paced back and forth, his finger tracing the neural band on his wrist. The fleeting images from Mira's encrypted memories kept him up that night, haunted his dreams. He owed it to Mira, to himself, and to his very ethos to confront this skull-faced demon of unauthorized neuro access. As the dawn spilled into his room next day, Eirik knew what he had to do. The mind sculptor was ready to dive deeper, ready for a war of a different kind. Eirik walked into his office, his expression hardened, the band on his wrist not just a tool now, but a weapon. Today's mining expedition inside Mira's mind had a clear goal. He was no longer a doctor curing PTSD, but a soldier combating a greater enemy, exploitation of his technology. Mira was already waiting. Her eyes bore into him as he entered, a mixture of relief and fear evident in fathomless depths. She understood the breadth of their situation, knew the dangers it brought forth. Eirik saw a soldier ready for combat. Without wasting time, they initiated the sculpt session again. Eirik now navigated the labyrinth of her mind with renewed determination. As he manipulated the maze of her psyche, he sensed a change. Mira was aiding him, acutely aware of their clandestine mission. The cryptic maze of her mental fortress was more yielding. Days morphed into nights as their sessions continued, each strand of the Crimson Code unraveled to reveal damning proof of how far the authorities were willing to compromise ethical boundaries to foster their military might. Eirik grew bolder with each fact uncovered. There was a sense of vindication that layered itself with the thick dread every time he slipped into the sculpt. It was like dancing on a razor blade. Any misstep could lead to irrevocable harm. But the dance must go on. Simultaneously, he began to prepare himself for a confrontation beyond decoding and stealthy maneuvers in the mindscape. His office hours extended into late nights spent poring over legislation and clauses, compiling evidence, forming alliances in dark corners of the lab. His profession was under threat. Mira's life was under threat, and he resolved to protect both. The officials had not stayed silent either. Eirik's clearance levels were suddenly questioned under routine checkups, his movement in the lab more scrutinized, his sessions with Mira constantly patrolled. Yet he maintained his facade of compliance. One day, during a particularly grueling decryption, Eirik finally unearthed conclusive evidence, a carefully insulated cluster of memory sequences revealing confidential military plans. He surfaced from the sculpt, a grim resolution lining his face. Mira watched him, her gaze echoing his thoughts. The stakes were now undeniable. The soldier and the sculptor shared a pregnant pause. Eirik broke the silence first, his voice steady. It's time to act, Mira. It's not just about you or me anymore. They are weaponizing minds, molding them into walking, breathing vaults of data. This ends with us. Mira's nod was slow, understanding the full weight of Eirik's words. Their silent pact was sealed. The calm before the storm had ended, heralding the onset of a war, an uprising from the neural pathways of the mind. The sculptor-cum-soldier stood at the precipice of a daunting battle, his weapon not gunpowder, but the might of shared knowledge, his battleground not covered in trenches, but woven in the mindscape. For the first time, he felt the promise of a storm, coaxing his usually steady heartbeat into a gallop. The whispers of an uprising were taking form, brewing within Mira's cerebral labyrinth and the four walls of Eirik's office. The night was about to bear witness to a revolution invoked from the neural grid of human cognition. That night, cloaked by darkness and the steady hum of the city's neon-lit pulse, a clandestine operation unfolded in the precincts of the Neuroarchitecture Lab. Eirik found a covert way to leak the damning evidence to recreational mind sculptors, veteran technicians, and other allies in the city's neural web outskirts, away from the scrutinizing gaze of the authorities. But alongside, the grip of the officials began to cinch tighter. Routine security checks turned into glaring surveillance. Eirik knew it was a cat-and-mouse game now, a dance of deception under prying eyes. But what they were unaware of was Mira's involvement, an unknown ally on the inside. Soon, whispers of the deception began to echo across the digital forums. The Architect Guild, neuronomads, freelance code writers, all began to rally behind Eirik, their shared outrage pawing the ground, ready to charge. On one unsuspecting evening, the silent war broke surface. The authorities arrested Mira under swathes of national security. As they hauled her away, Eirik watched from the confines of his office, his eyes piercing through the glass walls. He saw the authorities' smirking satisfaction. He also noticed Mira's eyes, defiant, resolute. She was a soldier, even in shackles. That night, Eirik was under house arrest. His clearance revoked, neural band confiscated. The lab he had known his entire life was now a looming, unapproachable monument under heavy guard. But the fight was far from over. The personal loss only fanned the flame, each flicker of doubt turning into a blazing torch of defiance. Eirik was stripped of his armor, but his weapon rested within him. He spent his days of incarceration strategizing, planning his next move like a seasoned chess player. With a looming ban on his neural maneuvering and his key ally apprehended, it was time for a gambit. The next move would decide the fate of the war Eirik had waged against the malicious authority. And with each passing moment, the resolution crystallized within him. He had to turn himself into the data vault, a mirror reflection to Mira's plight. He managed to get a neural band from the underground network of mind sculptors, a low-grade version of his usual tech. Yet, it was all he needed. It was a bold move, transgressing ethical boundaries. But drastic times, he thought, require drastic measures. Thus, inside the stillness of his formerly bustling office, Eirik chose himself as his next patient. His forehead was damp, his adrenaline-fueled heart pounding more erratically with every passing second. He silenced the voices of trepidation, the echoes of rationality. His resolve held, an unwavering flame against the storm of fears threatening to extinguish it. A deep breath, a flash of light on the neural band, and then Eirik Finnegan, the legendary mind sculptor, dove into himself. That night, the storm began in earnest. The clock was ticking. The doomsday countdown had started. There was no turning back now. Outside in the crisp city night, beyond the layers of security, something was astir. Eirik's act was a declaration of defiance, a spark that ignited the rebellion. The echo of his revolt bounced off buildings high and low, like a primal scream overtaking the city's neon-lit pulse. The siege had begun. The labyrinth of Eirik's mind unfolded with a poetic familiarity. He navigated his neural pathways with a manic desperation, forging forward through the cluster of personal and professional memories. His target was not any encrypted military code, but his own supreme knowledge of mind sculpting. The pain seared through him as he etched the intricate art of thought manipulation into his memory schemas. Each neural pathway he sculpted moaned in protest, each synapse sparking in rebellion. Eirik pushed on nonetheless. His determination overrode the screaming exhaustion of his own consciousness. He emerged from his mental maze breathless, the neural bands slipping from his forehead as he collapsed onto the floor, gasping. Buried within his mind was his profession's mastery, concealed behind a confounding riddle that only a seasoned mind sculptor could solve. Underneath layers of the riddle lay a cyan thread, the last thread holding his sanity together amidst the whirlwind of defiance he had uncorked. The morning after gave birth to a whirlpool of chaos unlike any Eirik had witnessed before. He was arrested when the officials discovered the unauthorized neural band and whisked away for penal action. His self-inflicted act of rebellion was out in the open now. The inside echo had turned into an outside roar. In the secured tribunal, flanked by stern-faced authorities, he stood tall, the secret weapon within him throbbing with silent intensity. They probed his mind, but the woven enigma served its purpose, shielding his secret knowledge. Unable to decrypt the information, they had to make a choice. Each second they spent on Eirik was a second lost in hunting down the raging revolution outside. The silent soldier had to be let go, allowed to walk out into the heart of the resistance he had sparked. The release of Mira was his first victory, a small triumph amidst a sea of grand hurdles that lay ahead for Eirik and his comrades. But as the freed soldier locked eyes with him, Eirik knew it marked the beginning of a wave that was about to crash over the authoritarian reign. Unleashed upon a city torn between repression and uprising, Eirik Finnegan, the hunted soldier, was suddenly the hunter, the reluctant leader. His mind was the encrypted vault, an echo of Mira's past role, attracting every mind sculptor with its magnetic enigma. As Eirik walked into the heart of the resistance, every pulse bringing him closer to the rebellion he had sparked, he was no longer just Dr. Eirik Finnegan, the mind sculptor. He was Dr. Eirik Finnegan, the harbinger of a new age of resistance. The storm inside him, sheltered behind the enigmatic riddle, was now spiraling out, a full-blown hurricane roaring through the neon-lit city. In the cloistered labyrinth of his mind, the cyan thread he had tightly held onto glowed ever brighter. His last thread of sanity, his path to salvation, now served as the beacon of the revolution. The short story told in the confines of his office had escalated into an epic saga, his mind, the stage of an unfolding revolution. None knew how it would end, but he hoped in his heart the final chapter would spell freedom.